Well, you can turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. This morning we come back to chapter 7 with, and this just seems overly redundant to say, but in a complex and difficult text in Ecclesiastes. The text that when I read it, part of it to my 12-year-old, soon-to-be 13-year-old daughter a few weeks ago, she said, "That's in the Bible." Yeah, and so trying to wrap our minds around it and work our way through it this morning, I think will be profoundly helpful for us, and it will take some work this morning. So I'm thankful for your zeal to know and to understand the Word. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll read the text this morning. It'll really be Ecclesiastes 7, verses 25 down through 29. You know, as a guy who loves history, is a little bit of a history buff, I've always embraced the phrase by philosopher George Santayana, one that you've heard or heard reworded: those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. We certainly see that throughout history. If you're familiar with or aware of Napoleon invading Russia in the winter, some 130 years later, he had 600,000 troops and should have overwhelmed Russia, but he taught us, don't invade Russia in the winter. But Hitler didn't learn that lesson. And 130 years later, he did the same exact thing, which ultimately led to his defeat and the victory in World War II. And so the failure to understand or think about the past or history, he was doomed to repeat it. We can think of it with genocide. After World War II, with the slaughter of 11 million people, most world leaders came out and said, "We're never going to do this again. We'll never let this happen again. We will stop this." And yet in the late 70s, you have the Khmer Rouge, who slaughter 2 million of their own people. More recently, in 1994, you have the Hutu government that in the span of 100 days killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, and no one even knows how many they killed because of the mass graves and the way they went about it. Last year alone, 750,000 babies were aborted in the United States, just in the United States. And so all the claims of preventing genocide and protecting the weak and the vulnerable, the reality is we keep doing it, and it keeps happening around the world. Pandemics will happen. They have happened. You probably are most familiar with the Black Death, and then we have the Spanish flu, and now obviously we have COVID going on. This certainly fits with the theme in the book of Ecclesiastes of history almost being cyclical. And that passage turned into the song by the birds, and turn, 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 and things just keep seeming to come about time after time after time. That's really an important way to think about what we're going to look at this morning, because the teacher, Solomon, Koheleth, he's in a difficult season. He goes through seasons of adversity like all of us do. And in that season of adversity, one of his solutions has been to look for more knowledge, more information. And if you remember when we left off with Ecclesiastes a few weeks ago, he had pursued head knowledge and more information and more regulation. That's actually going to help me out. And he discovers that it doesn't. It doesn't solve the difficult trials of life. It doesn't answer the complexities of life. And so now what he does is he turns instead to experiential knowledge. And he has this concept that there seem to be lots of people out there that have a lot more fun and life seems to go well for them. And so let me go down that road. And I'm going to explore both folly and the foolishness that this world has to offer. And maybe that's the answer. And I'll get experience, and that'll give me knowledge, and that will make me happier. That will solve the trials of my life. And as he does that, what we will find in verses 25 through 29 is a repeating of history. And what Solomon's experience lead him to is actually a return to the Garden of Eden. And it's why frequently when we talk about Ecclesiastes, we talk about Ecclesiastes of trying to do life in this twisted or this other Eden. How do we live life in this very lost, fallen, and warped world? And so that's what he's going to go after, and you're going to find, as we work through the text, a number of poetic references back to that. And the way you can begin to understand verses 25 through 29 is Solomon attempting to make sense of this world through his experience, and actually all he does is reproduce what Eve does in the garden. And so with that in your minds, verse 25 through 29 of chapter 7. "I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman, whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. We're really going to understand and see this morning that the same harm and the same hope for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are here for us in our other Eden. As you and I live lives in this very twisted Eden with thorns and thistles and wickedness and sorrows and pains and suffering, the trials of life, what we find is Solomon has the same kind of temptation constantly happening, that there's something that has been withheld from him, and if he could only gain what is being held back from him, then that is what will make sense of the world. And all he finds in that pursuit is more suffering and more destruction. And it's the same temptation that exists for you and I. And so the best way for us to understand it is, first of all, what we'll do is through all of this text is we'll look at how this happens in the garden. We'll see how it happens in Solomon's life as through his experiential pursuit. And then we'll see how it applies to you and I this morning. And so we need to understand this deadly fruit. This whole passage is bookended by a really important term, and it's the term scheme. Verse 25, I turn my heart to know and search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things. You get down to verse 29, it's a clear reference back to the garden and creation. See, this alone, I found that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. We understand it's a reference even back to creation in the garden because we are all now fallen creatures. Adam and Eve were the only humans that ever existed on this world who were morally neutral. They were not confirmed in their righteousness, but they also were not wicked. They did not have the sinful flesh like you and I have. Romans, which says that all have sinned, all have gone astray. There's none that seek after God. That was not true initially for Adam and Eve. They were created upright. And so he's referencing the initial creation and this initial fall. And so when you begin to understand that that's the way Solomon is thinking through this pursuit of experience, it begins to unpack and unwrap the complexities of this text. And so how do we think about schemes? What is this scheme? What number of ways for you to begin to process through it? It's a seeking to understand more. It's really more of an accounting phrase than anything else. It's the kind of thing of seeing the final tally and balancing your checkbook and seeing the final number, making sure everything matches up all the way through. It's an understanding of the end of an event so that you can actually discern its cause and effect. Economists do this all the time. When somebody studies economics, that's not just finances. Frequently the study of economics is a logical study. What is the process and how do we get here? And so if I can figure out how we arrived where we're at and all the steps that led there, then I will also be able to determine my future by changing the things that I do. Schemes is this understanding of the complexity so that you can not just diagnose a problem, but so that you can also prevent its future occurrence. It's to determine then ultimately what is good or what is evil, and the determination is based on the outcome of a thing. Now already you begin to understand this phrasing of schemes then is going to have a problem. Why do I say that? Because who is the one that is ultimately to determine what is good and evil? Is your experience and my experience the determination of what is good and what is evil? Is it good or evil that Johnny Erickson Tada dives headfirst into part of the Chesapeake Bay and is rendered a paraplegic for the rest of her life? Well, on its very surface, we would say that's evil. And yet Johnny Erickson Tada says it's good. And someone contracts a deadly disease, and God used the fear of death to draw them to salvation. Is that good or evil? Harm comes to someone, is it good or evil? And the reality is, if we try to judge good and evil on our experiences alone, we will frequently get it wrong. Is it good or evil that Jesus is sweating great drops of blood, that the greatest crime that's ever committed in the history of humanity is the wholesale murder of the Son of God, perfect and holy? Is it good or evil? And so understanding these things begins to help us to see that the word schemes, there's a lot packed into it. It's starting to rob God of his authority. It's beginning to think about life in such a way that I can determine and I can control what is going to happen. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I'm never going to let someone hurt me like that again. You ever said those things internally? You ever thought, well, I'll never do that again, relationally, economically, physically, with your health? It's to be able to predict and to control what the end of a matter ultimately will be. Solomon says that he wants wisdom. He wants to understand how things work. He said he wants to seek wisdom and the scheme of things. He wants the conclusion of what will to come so that he can avoid the adversity that he's experiencing. The World Series is going on right now, and so all the predictors and the announcers, they look at the stats and they look at the lineups and they try to predict who's going to win the World Series. That's light stuff. We're going to elect a new president or re-elect the same president here in just a few weeks, and people are trying to predict. And I don't know about you, but I'm already exhausted by hearing poll numbers and all those things. And that's heavier than the World Series, but at the end of the day, and I'm not saying it's inconsequential, please hear me right, but that's 4 years. Trying to predict what's going to happen to a child when they're born, what they will do and what will be done to them is far heavier. Seeing a couple on their wedding day, and yet as they covenant together in sickness and in health and richer and poorer, and to know what will their marriage be like in 5 years or 50 years is far heavier stuff. To try to understand the scheme of a thing is to look at these and try to get outside of your current time bubble to figure out what is going to be the good and evil of what is going to happen. If I could only know how this will turn out, we would say in our own hearts. In a season of trial or adversity, if I could only know how this will end, then I'd be able to either prepare for it, I'd better be able to handle it, I'd better be able to know. That scheme of things, have you ever been tempted to think that way? If I could only see the light at the end of the tunnel, if I only knew what the next 6 months held, if I only knew what would happen this next year, then I would be able to emotionally rest and I'd be fine. And so Solomon's knowledge is gained by experience here, all through the book of Ecclesiastes, but significantly here. He's trying out all kinds of behavior. That's what he means by the folly and the foolishness here. He's trying out all kinds of behavior to figure out, does this make life better? Does this actually help my seasons of adversity? That's the idea of schemes in verse 25. I'm trying to figure this out. It's a little bit like if you go to a city, and if you want to navigate a city safely, particularly if you've never been raised in a city or lived in a city, but even from city to city, if you want to know how to get around that city safely, you better talk to somebody who grew up in that city. I've talked to my children about the fact, having grown up in Baltimore, literally you would know, and we knew what street you could go down and which street you couldn't. And that would change block to block. There were streets I could walk down safely. You literally cross one block over and you're in fear of your life. Went on visitation one time and was visiting with a lady who had visited our church. I was in my early 20s, and halfway through our visit, we started hearing gunfire outside, and it was two warring gangs, drug-dealing gangs on the opposite corners, and they were trading gunshots. And so it's a surreal experience to be on church visitation, laying on the living room floor, hoping no rounds come through the windows. We were on the wrong street. The lady lived on the wrong street. I was sharing with some folks from our church. They visited Baltimore some time ago, and I encouraged them. They were going to stay at a hotel, and Inner Harbor is known in Baltimore, and they said, I want to go visit the harbor. I said, great, just take a taxi. They said it's like 3-4 blocks away, something like that. I said, I'm telling you, you get 1 block away from the Inner Harbor, and you're going to get mugged. Trust me, you will. A police patrol right there, and nobody from Baltimore goes more than a block away from the Inner Harbor. And they believed me, and they took a taxi. Some friends of theirs didn't, and they got mugged walking back. To know the scheme of things is to understand the way the world is working. And what Solomon is saying is, as I'm going through this world, it seems like there are people with street smarts who seem a lot happier than I am. It seems like people are living in the world outside of the boundaries of what God says is good and evil, and their life just seems a lot better than mine. I want to know the scheme of things so that I can have the same better life. And the only way I know to do it is to go through experience. This other bookend then is down at verse 29. Here he goes back to creation with Adam and Eve and their uprightness. He goes back to their moral neutrality, and he points out the problem. What was the problem? They sought out many schemes. Now, we're going to have to unpack what that means, because Solomon is putting a word on this that's a little unfamiliar to us, and we are more familiar with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is what Solomon is talking about, a hidden knowledge that I can gain by experience that God is holding back from me. Ultimately, we could think of it like this. The pursuit of schemes is believing there's some other knowledge out there you can get It's beyond what God has provided that will make you happy. You're standing there at Let's Make a Deal and you've got your microwave, but you're willing to trade it in for whatever's behind door number 2. And you're hoping you don't get, I think it was the zonk or the donkey. You hope you can trade up rather than trade down. When are you tempted that way? When are you tempted to think, certainly there's something outside of God's word, outside of what God said is right and wrong, good and evil, healthy or sick, and that will make my life better. If I could only have this thing or this relationship, if I could only have this health, this bank account, then life would be better. And I see all these people out here, and they're living outside of what I see God calling us to do, and they have that happiness. I want that experience. And so it's chasing after this kind of idea, this schemes. And so if we think back then, since Solomon is addressing them in the garden, what happened to the garden? Well, we could go back to Genesis 3 and we can actually see what happens. The woman has this conversation with Satan, taking on the form of the serpent. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die.'" I'm not going to unpack everything that's going on here. There's lots of deception that is happening. We just want to try to laser focus in on how this helps us understand our text in Ecclesiastes. So yes, there's deception. Yes, she's lying. At this moment, that's not actually what God said. She's adding to his word. So we know the corruption is already taking place here. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God." And he identifies it in a very specific way, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Solomon calls it a desire for schemes in Ecclesiastes 7. While in the garden, it's identified as this knowledge, this desire for the knowledge of good and evil. Eve believes in this moment the lie of the serpent, that there has been some knowledge that has been held back from her. There's some information God is afraid for her to have and is controlling enough that doesn't want her to have it, and it would make life better for her if she could simply have it. Knowledge that belongs to God alone, knowledge that she wants. She's duped into believing at this moment that God is robbing her of this. It's interesting because later in Genesis chapter 3, God acknowledges that when she eats of the fruit and Adam eats of the fruit, that they do obtain this knowledge. I read you from Genesis 3:22, first part. "Then the Lord God said, 'Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil.'" So what is this knowledge then of good and evil? It's at the very core of decision making. It's the basis of judgment. It's the ability to discern what's right and what's wrong. But it also comes at a significant cost, because it comes at a cost of eyes open, but also hearts now open to evil desires, wrong motives, and deceptive decisions. At its very core, it is the idea that we now make judgment of what is good and evil instead of God making judgment of what is good and evil. It's not what God says is right or wrong. We now determine what is right or wrong. I like how one preacher put it that I think is very helpful. He says it this way: she wouldn't know good and evil in the way that she thought she would. That is, God knows good and evil in the way a cancer surgeon knows cancer, which is very different from the way a patient knows cancer. God knows the good and evil outside of himself. She knew good and evil inside of herself. She knew the cancer as a victim, not as a physician. When she ate of the tree, she immediately knew good and evil. Was there some magic in the fruit? No. Was there some magic in the tree? No. What happened to make her know good and evil? Well, she already knew good. God has declared all is good. She has a husband. She has fruit to eat of the tree. There is unity, there is delight, there is safety. She knew all things that were good. Indeed, when God finishes creating woman, he looks at all of his creation, he says, "This is good." She knew good. What happened to make her know evil was that she had done evil. She knew it not by cognition or understanding mentally the way she knew good. She knew evil by experience. She judged in that moment God's law. His law that said don't eat. She judged it to be too restrictive. She wanted God's knowledge, but it comes without his perfectly powerful, holy nature. God's character has been brought into question. He's unkind and he is deceptive, and God is holding back from you, and God is afraid of you, and God is trying to domineer you, and God is trying to control you. But there's a way that you can actually be elevated out of that condition, and it can be if you eat of this tree. The knowledge of good and evil is schemes. How is a life working? And I should be the one in control of it. And so she eats. The quest for knowledge is a quest against God in this moment. So then how do we see it in the teacher's life? Well, if you come back to Ecclesiastes, he says, I turn my heart to know, to search out, and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things. And listen to what he knows. Here God has declared certain things evil, other things good, but he wants to know the wickedness of folly. He wants to know the foolishness that is madness. This is fascinating because similar to Eve, Solomon, the Koheleth, the teacher, has a significant gift, right? So Eve was gifted with all that was good, and yet her heart is duped. Well, you remember that Solomon is the guy that God looks upon, and Solomon is righteous, and Solomon loves God, and he's the son of the one who has a heart that seeks after God, and God offers him a gift, and do you remember what Solomon asked for? We usually capture it in one little word in Sunday school classes, right? We capture it as he wanted wisdom. But this is how the text reads in 1 Kings 3:9. This is Solomon's words. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? Solomon, and then God gives him this gift. Solomon was already gifted with the ability to discern from God's perspective what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. What Solomon wants is beyond what God has gifted him. It's not enough for him. Does that sound similar? Eve has been given everything good. It's not enough for her. Solomon has been given this wisdom and this kind of discernment. It's not enough for him. It's not enough to help him deal with the adversity of life. It's not enough to help him deal with the confusion of seeing the innocent suffer, the wrong go free, the unrighteous prosper, and the righteous suffer. In that moment, he declares it's not good enough. His heart craves more. And so by experience, he falls down the same well as Eve. It's a removal from the submission to the wisdom, righteousness, and goodness of God. Instead, it's an attempt to pass judgment based on your experiences instead of on the objective truth of God. This allure of experiential good and evil is profound for all of us. And so then we can look and see how we do it today. And so we think of Eve standing in the garden, having this conversation with the serpent, and it's such this pure moment of obvious deception. We see Solomon in Ecclesiastes wrestling with the same concept. And so here he's in a twisted Eden, and it's as though the fruit is in front of him all the time. And his heart craves this experiential knowledge that goes beyond what God has declared. And it's the same for you and I as we live in our twisted Edens. As Christians, we are called to grow in our understanding of what is good and evil. But how do we grow in our understanding of what is good and evil? We go back to Hebrews 5, where it tells us that as we spiritually mature, as you and I live spirit-filled lives informed by the Word, that's how we're to discern what is good and evil. We are to take everything that goes through life, all of our experiences, all of our information, and we're to pour it down through it as though this is a filter, a sieve, a colander, and we're to dump it in, and everything that falls out is what's true. That's how we're to interpret what's going on in our lives. And the problem is sometimes when that drops out, we don't like what we see. We don't like what we experience. We don't like what we go through. We look around us and we see people that seem to live lives that are much happier than our lives. They've lived lives bent on nothing but economic success, and they're wealthy, and they have a lot, and they just seem so much happier. We do work with people that step on other people's heads and take credit for things that they have not done, and who lie and cheat and steal, and they never get caught, and they seem happier. We look at people that are not zealous about studying the Word or living in a godly way, and they seem happier than us. I think the first time I experienced that as a child was going to school, and all my friends were having experiences that were held back from me from growing up in a Christian home. And I felt robbed. They talked about movies they had seen that there's not a chance on earth my parents would ever have let me watch. They talked about bands they were listening to and concerts they had gone to. When I was in 7th grade, a bunch of my friends, they all went to a heavy metal rock concert. It was their first exposure to smoking pot, and they all came back excited about it. And those were some of my first experiences of feeling like I was being robbed of the joys of life. Some knowledge was being held back from me. It's exactly what happens as young people are growing up, and suddenly there's an awakening of sexual desire, and we live in a sex-crazed world, and the lie is something is being held back from you. We see people around us who live lives of abandon, and it seems like they're so much happier. And we're tempted in that moment to believe if I could only have those same experiences, then I would be happy. Just think about it. There's no pressure of spiritual guilt or conviction. We wonder, how in the world do people function this way? And they seem to function with blithe indifference to what they're doing and the sins they're committing. And yet the Bible tells us that they are hardening and even searing their consciences. And we just don't feel a freedom to sin in the same way, but they seem happier than us. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to go through life without the spiritual guilt? We see other people, they have a difficult relationship with someone, or there's some relational breach, so they cut it off. And the Bible's calling us to walk in and get smacked on one side of our face and take it on the other. I'd like to do some hitting back every now and then. It seems like I'd be a lot happier if I could do that. Let me get my shots in. Here we're called to give to the poor, give generously, live sacrificially, pursue holiness. And so what happens is I think it bears out two ways for you and I as we are standing in front of the tree in our twisted Eden all the time. First of all, the belief that there's some experience of those who live outside of God's word that we are missing out on. That there is some joy, delight, or happiness held back from us. But then secondarily, the belief that what God has told us or brought into our lives is unfair, unreasonable, a result of him not being loving, caring, or tender to us. Suddenly, we go through difficulties. We go through adversity, as Ecclesiastes 7 titles it. And we start reading life through our experience. And in that moment, it is like we are standing in front of the tree. And am I going to believe that all that God is saying about my suffering and my adversity, am I going to believe that that is true? Or am I going to believe there's some hidden nugget out here, if I would just grasp it, then I would feel better about life? And so there's all these pop psychologists, and they say boundaries. And so God says to continually, lovingly pursue people, to speak truth in love. And so if there's going to be a cut-off relationship, it's going to be the result of unrepentance. And you need to confront in love. You need to speak truth in love. You need to exhort, admonish, encourage one another. You need to provoke one another to love and good works. And people are reacting against that. But there's all these other people out here that are saying, no, you don't have to do any of that. That's just not good for you. Man, you can't fly like an eagle when you're swarmed with turkeys. Right? You're going to be far happier. Cut off that mess. And there's no filtering through and they just all seem happier people. Meanwhile, the reality is I'm so glad Jesus didn't follow that mantra, because let's be honest, he's the eagle and we the turkeys. But we don't want to filter it that way. We think some experiential knowledge will deliver us. And so we eat of the fruit and you move on in the garden and you go through it, and the reality is there's a fate worse than death. In the context of questing for knowledge, Solomon is saying his experience of searching out all knowing by experience mirrors what takes place in the garden. We see it in Genesis 3:16 with Eve, what happens. There's lots that happens, right? They eat the fruit immediately experiential knowledge. And I think, boy, if the Spirit's at work in your life and you're tracking with me, you know what this is like. When you go down that road of experience, the first thing that comes is shame. That's the first thing that arrives. And I remember the first time I was playing baseball with my friends in an empty lot, and somebody said there was a magazine somebody had found in the woods. And I knew to the core of my being I should go home right away and tell my parents. And I didn't. And I thought in that moment, that fruit hanging out in front of me, that the experiential knowledge would make me happier. And all I experienced was shame. There are things I have seen, things I have done, things I have said, things I've heard, that I would give anything to not have said, seen, heard, or done those things. And that's exactly what they experience. The lie is so profound. The very first effects are shame and distance in their relationship with one another, even as they are dead in their relationship toward God. But as God begins to bring consequence, we find this amazing moment of a consequence toward Eve in particular that Solomon is going to pick up on. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. That word desire there, it's the same exact word it uses later when God speaks to Cain, and he says, the desire of sin, it's crouching at your door. That's the same exact language. What it simply means is that with the introduction of the buying in of this experiential kind of knowledge of good and evil, part of the curse of the fall is the woman seeking to control, to take authority, to have power over their husbands. It's a life that's set on control of situations and relationships that they have to fight against. It's the direct result of this knowledge of good and evil. Why? Because there's now an awareness and reality of the ease of a woman to be abused by and dominated by men in a sinful way. It's torturous to them. It's relationship destructive. As women seek control when they give in to this sinful curse, and men dominate in unloving ways where they refuse to lead in sacrificial protection, we see the fruit of knowing good and evil by its presence in us. And we experience the fruit of good and evil by having it done against us. It's a horrific consequence. This is why if you go all the way to Hebrews and or 1 Peter and it talks about Sarah, it talks about by faith she submitted. Why? It takes faith, a convinced belief that what God has said is the way this relationship should work. Because the proneness for fear is there. And let's be honest, hers was not an unreasonable fear. I mean, let's be real. Was Abraham, had he kind of proven himself to be the cowardly husband who will lie to save his own skin? Yes. I mean, are you joking me? God says she's still supposed to have some level of deference? But that is exactly what God says. And her experience is waging a war inside of her. And she already knows what it's like when she gives into those fears. And she takes control of the situation. And so we have Ishmael. And so the temptation here is profound in her life. And so what's interesting is God says, I will not let humanity live this way. That's a fate worse than death. Death is better than you and I living eternity like this. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. You know what he's saying is Adam and Eve would be standing outside the garden, and they would suddenly start to experience all this sin in the world, and their heart would want nothing more than to go back into the garden. And he says no, because to live forever like this is a fate worse than death. And that's exactly what Solomon says and what Solomon means. Oh, my Prezi's out of order. Here we go. So for the teacher, come back to Ecclesiastes. I find something more bitter than what? Death. The woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Solomon's questing in life had brought him into relationship with the exact kind of woman who doesn't fight against the tendency to control. His 700 wives and his 300 concubines. So how does he describe it? He describes this is a fate worse than death. The searching of experiential knowledge has not made life better. It'd be better for me to be dead. At least if I was dead, I wouldn't be captured in these kinds of domineering, controlling, manipulative relationships. Relationships where the woman gives in to her sin bents and she wants to dominate, control, and manipulate, and relationships where the man gives in to his sin bents where either he goes along with whatever she says or he tries to sinfully dominate and never leads her. He says, this is horrible. And he's exactly right. And if you've ever done marriage like that, you know it's miserable. You know you would not want it. You warn people, listen, a bad marriage is 1,000 times worse than whatever your misery is as a single every day of the week. You don't want it. We see it in our day. The teacher, Solomon, he also is the one who writes Proverbs with all of its warnings against the treacherous woman. But he also writes all of his warnings about the simple man who's taken in by her. So while Solomon points out here significantly the role of the woman, and we would ask the question, why does he do that? And you really are left with two primary answers. One of them is either Solomon is a misogynistic jerk who hates women. That's one option. Or option B, he is highlighting that he experienced exactly what happened in the garden. Now, your problem with saying he's a misogynistic jerk is the dude did get married 700 times, had 300 concubines, and in chapter 9 of Ecclesiastes, he extols the virtues of being married to a righteous woman, writes most of Proverbs, which extols also lady wisdom and how good it is when a young man finds a good wife. And so when you go down misogynistic jerk road, you end up with liberal theology that then questions did Solomon even write it. I'm just telling you that's one path. Or the other path is that Solomon's experience mirrors exactly what God said was going to happen in the garden. When they wanted to quest after the knowledge of good and evil, when they wanted to quest after schemes and figure things out, when they thought there was some pleasure, some happiness that God had hidden from them, kind of like a guy where God would call him to love one wife and instead he marries 700. God is robbing me of some delight. God is hiding from me some good. And so he goes on this experiential quest and he suffers for it. It's kind of like in our culture where the woman is tempted to think that God's judgment of what is good and evil is not accurate. It's when, dear sisters, when your heart is tempted, I just want to be clear, I think it's a temptation that I don't think it's a mandate that women give into. I think the man is tempted to be lazy and a terrible leader, i.e. he doesn't want the thorns and thistles of the gardens of his life. I think on the converse side, the woman, there's a temptation here that my life would be happier if I made those decisions, if I was in control. And so in that moment, they judge. Submission is not good, power is good. Deference is not good, but aggression is good. Meekness isn't good, but power on display is good. The man is tempted to think that sacrificial loving leadership isn't good, but domineering authoritarianism is good. Caring for your wife like a treasured vessel isn't good, but treating her like chinette that I throw in the trash is the better course. I need to put her in her place. Instead of leading her with exhortation, confrontation, and encouragement, that she is one for you to help grow in her Christ-likeness. Instead, you don't want conflict, so you go along with whatever she says and whatever she wants. And you mask it by saying, she's smarter, she's more talented than I am, even though the course she would lead your family on is actually unbiblical, and the sheer fact that she's the one leading your home, God declares is evil. But you'd rather have peace than conflict. In those moments, whether you're a man or you're a woman, we are judging against what God has said is good and evil, and we are saying my experience tells me what's good and evil. And we've eaten of the tree. And we're munching the fruit, and we can feel the bitterness of the Granny Smith apple in the back of our throat. It's a fate worse than death. The reality is the same harm and the same hope in the Garden of Eden of Adam and Eve are here for us in this other Eden that we call home. And so how do we work through it? Well, the same hope, though, is for us as is there for them. And so let me take you back to the garden. There is hope. The proto-evangelium, the first gospel, is what it means in Genesis 3:15. What is their hope? I will put enmity between you and the woman, and when he's speaking to the serpent, and between your offspring and her offspring, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, Adam and Eve don't know when this is going to come, but that's their hope. Their hope for deliverance from this sinful fruit they've eaten and all the destruction they've brought is that there's going to be a child who's going to come from them, and he's going to destroy all that is evil. They don't know when it's going to happen, so their firstborn son, Cain, they literally name him Weapon or Spear. They thought he'd be the serpent killer. That's an amazing moment of faith. Like, great, God's given us a son. Let's name him Spear, Weapon, Snake Killer, essentially. But then, as we all know, Cain rises up and kills his own brother. And so they named their thirdborn son Anointed Replacement. Their faith hadn't wavered. They just thought, okay, well, then it'll be the next one. They had no idea it'd be thousands of years before Jesus Christ walks the earth. They were longing and hoping that someone would come. Some man would come and fix this. Adam lives 930 years, surrounded by destroyed homes, mangled marriages, murder and destruction. Each child, grandchild, great-grandchild, and so on, warped as a result of this quest for schemes. They longed for and they hoped for the one to come. Solomon puts it in amazing language. He picks up the same theme, and so if you go to verse 27, you see as he returns this idea of his own garden experience. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher. Now you have this long parenthetical phrase. That's an interruption here. So he's going to tell us the one thing he found, so we're going to be looking for whenever that is. But he says, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. In other words, all my trying by experiential knowledge to make sense of the suffering of this world hasn't worked. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Now he gets down to it. This is kind of the end of the parenthetical. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So that phrase there is fascinating, one man among 1,000. So again, we're confronted with two options. Either Solomon is a misogynistic jerk and he's saying women have no wisdom, no righteousness, no goodness in them at all, which is absolutely contrary to lots of other things he writes. Or he's speaking in poetic terms, and this is a poetic term. And you're actually very familiar with one. Have you ever heard, I found them and they were 1 in a million? What do we mean by that phrase? Incredibly rare and incredibly good, right? Guess what? That's exactly what it means in Hebrew poetry. Incredibly good, incredibly rare. So our question would be, who's the 1 in 1,000 that he found? Well, in the context of Ecclesiastes 7, what has he already said? He said way back earlier, he has not found a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins, verse 20. He's looking for a man who would live purely and who would live righteously, who's looking for the 1 in 1,000 who would deliver from all this experiential warped life. And he didn't find him ultimately. Instead, all he finds, because this is the darkness of Ecclesiastes, and why many say it's the most oppressive book, he ends on a note that doesn't seem very hopeful or helpful. Because he says, man just keeps doing this. And so it's like, where do we go then in this twisted Eden? Where does Solomon go with it? Where does he go in this life that just seems to be this endless cycle of plucking experiential fruit of schemes or the knowledge of the tree of good and evil and then wrecking our lives and suffering and constantly being lied and constantly being deceived? Where do we go with this? And here's what's fascinating. If you go to the end of Ecclesiastes, eventually he will get there. And so I can't preach the end of Ecclesiastes in chapter 7, but I will point your eyes to verses 13 and 14 of chapter 12. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Did you catch that? What Solomon says, the real answer is let God determine what is good and evil, rather than you and I trying to determine by experience, by schemes, what is good and evil. So there's two truths. Two truths. How do we turn from this? Truth number one, make the knowledge you seek to gain be whatever God says is good and evil. Stop buying the lie that you can experience something out of the bounds of what God has determined is right or wrong, and that is what will make you happy. That you can somehow get on a course that pursues all the folly and the foolishness of this world, that God condemns, and you will be delighted. You can cut off relationships. You can do whatever to take care of your physical health. You can do whatever is required to be a financial success. Look at all these people that seem so much happier than you, even though God calls you to not set your life on the things of this world. But if you would set your things on the life of the world, you believe, you're deceived, you pluck the fruit, I can be happy. I'm in a season of suffering. I don't ever want to suffer again. I want what they have to offer. And what Solomon says is ultimately, no, let God's authority tell you what is good and evil. Not your experience or someone else's. But the reality is we're actually hardwired for experiential knowledge. We go through life and we do experience things. And so what do we do with them? And so I think secondarily is make the experiential knowledge of your life be about the person and love of God. It's what Paul prays in Ephesians 3:14 through 19. Desperate for the people of God. I read to you, he says this, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know," and it's an experiential knowledge there, "to know by experience the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God." Here's the reality of it. In that moment in the garden, Eve had a profound opportunity. She had a profound opportunity when the serpent is calling the character of God into question. And he's saying he doesn't love you, he doesn't care for you, he's not interested in you, he's actually afraid of you, and he's trying to control you and domineer you because he doesn't want you to be like him. She had an opportunity in that moment to say, check that mess, because God's going to come walking in the cool of the garden, and I want to chat with him about it, because all I've known from him is goodness and love and kindness. Solomon has the opportunity, as he stands in front of it and as he goes through the adversities of life, to reject the temptation of all the seeming happiness and partying and delight of everyone else, and he has the opportunity to say, no, better that will I be, more joyful will I be in the house of God than anywhere else, than serving before God than anywhere else. You and I have a profound opportunity in our adversity. Will we learn by experiential knowledge the love, compassion, tenderness, wisdom, and righteousness of God? And you can learn it in seasons of adversity like no other time. Where will my next meal come from? And suddenly, you begin to experience God's glorious provision, maybe through other believers, maybe through other means, maybe through miracle, I don't know, but God said he would not see his children go hungry or begging bread, and he says if you ask for bread and fish, he would not give you serpents and gravel, and suddenly you see God begin to meet your needs. You go through physical seasons of adversity, and it seems like all these other people are happy, but God says to cry out to him, to pray, seek wise counsel. Yes, seek medical care, absolutely. But don't be deceived that by thinking you can put more coins into the coin slot of God, pull the arm, that somehow he's going to reward you. That's not how he works. And instead, you begin to learn sustaining grace and strength, and he gives you a deeper testimony, an opportunity to minister to others in season of adversity. You go through relational trials and strife, and everyone else says, just cut him off, get away from him. The best thing for you to do is to avoid conflict and not deal with it. Don't disciple, don't invest. That just makes life harder for you. And instead, you begin to understand Jesus knows exactly what it's like to pour his life into people who don't respond rightly. And he empowers you by grace and strength to do the same. The question is if you and I will keep plucking in our twisted Eden fruit, buying into the lies that my experiential knowledge of this world is what will make me happy, or if you and I will turn from it and begin to see on a daily, literally moment by moment basis at times, that knowing Christ deeper is the experiential knowledge my heart desperately needs. We live in a twisted Eden. See, this alone I found. God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. And Solomon is telling us that you and I live in the same kind of twisted Eden, plucking fruit. The same harm and the same hope for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are here for you and I in our other Eden, and it's found in the person of Jesus Christ. Father, we need happier. We need to taste more of you and be satisfied. Father, would you teach us to be satisfied in you alone? We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
For our closing hymn, please stand and sing with me number 18 in the black hymnal, the benediction hymn.